great pleasure to be chairing this panel, and the speakers will speak in the order in which it's set out. So I'm not going to read all that much about their biographies because you have it all in front of you. The first speaker is Malik Dahlan, who is the principal of the Institution Quraysh for Law and Policy, a multifaceted transnational think tank with offices in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UK. Professor Dahlan is currently a visiting professor at the Energy and Natural Resources Law Institute of Queen Mary University of London. And the title of his talk is The Hijaz in Perspective, Islamic Statehood and the Origins of Self-Determination. Dr. Dahlan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back here at the Middle East Institute of Singapore. And I think it's a sign when you speak between Gregory and Professor Matawi, you know it's clear that you made it or you're in a lot of trouble with Saudi Arabia. So I actually wanted to take you through a presentation that really lends itself as a good pretext for this conference. It has been exactly 100 years since the Arab Revolt of 1960. And I wanted to address specifically the crisis of Islam, which we're facing today. A topic that I must say was addressed by my great-grandfather, the former Mufti of Singapore almost 100 years ago. Of course, I stand here much less worthy of addressing the topic. The confrontation of the failed states in the region really brings out an acute awareness of what the failed state is causing, whether from Mesopotamia to the Levant, and of course the very fragile structures that we're looking at in terms of the Arabian Peninsula. The Hijaz, western part of Saudi Arabia, is of crucial significance in this conversation. It has been of crucial significance, and at the heart of those events is the first Islamic state 1400 years ago. It was the same in terms of its importance 100 years ago with the beginning of the Arab Renaissance, and I would argue it is going to be, and it is now an important part of the tensions that we're going to witness, but hopefully a force for peace and stability in terms of finding a way there. I think it's very useful to revisit some of the aspects of selective historical view of the last 100 years, with an idea to really engaging seriously and systemically with this hidden narrative. And it's hidden because there's an international legal history that seems to be missing. And I'll take you through some of those historical highlights. So, first of all, let me just point out, we all know where, I hope that everyone knows where Hijaz is, right? And we can see the lovely couple here that are from Singapore enjoying a selfie during Hajj, and hopefully that's a different depiction of how you can view Hajj in certain ways. This is the map of undiscovered Western Asia. The reason I put up this map is because this was produced by David Hogarth in 1908. It's part of my collection, and I'm very happy to say that in the Geographical Society it was presented to show some of the plans that the Great Britain had in the region, but more specifically for you can see the Hijaz Railroad and the connection with Damascus. We begin with the Damascus Protocol, specifically in terms of the secret society and the idea of nationalism that began, which the secret societies gave a mandate known as the Damascus Protocol to Prince Faisal, and Prince Faisal, the son of the Sharif of Hijaz, took that mandate with him to his father, again down back to Hijaz, to form a program. That program was viewed as the Arab Renaissance, Nahda. That was the first title that the Sharif took on. The intention was to fight disease, poverty, and ignorance. The intention was for the Hijaz to lead the project for independence through the Arab Revolt, and of course engage with the British and the international community in terms of the position of Arabs through one unified singular Arab state from Aleppo all the way to Aden. And this has been a concept or a subject of great contention all the way to 1939 in what has been canonized by George Antonius as the Arab Awakening. Of course, there were other plans at the time, as we all know, the former Sykes-Picot, and the Darim Pact of 1915 with Ibn Saud, which, by the way, wasn't a recognition, but rather a guarantee of the Wahhabi forces not to have incursions on Qatar, Qatar, Kuwait, and the Turkish states. Very quickly, here's the timeline, and I'm going to point out, oops, let me take it back so that nobody has a look. The Great Arab Revolt. Once the mandate was given, the countries during the Great War engaged with the idea of self-determination, which is an international legal concept at the time that is ethnocentric in the formulation of states. It was also meant to give a view, a vision of what the state would look like, and of course we know it ended in 1918 with the arrival at Damascus. The next point is really 1919 during the peace conference, and you can see that Prince Faisal here was part of the Paris conference, claiming a place not only for Hijaz as a state, but specifically putting the Arab agenda on the table, as with Wilson, George Lloyd, and Clemenceau as well. And funny enough, Wilson's 14 points on self-determination, there are reports that he actually tried to speak to Lloyd and so convincing him that Arabs would be the greatest candidates for the Hijaz delegation for benefiting from the idea of self-determination. Here is the treaty itself. You can see the Hijaz delegation represented all the way through. This was a source of contention for the Hijaz delegation because they saw themselves representing the Arabs and not just Hijaz, but clearly original and historic claims of the first and founding member of the League of Nations, the only Islamic and Arab state. Another important point for us is 1920, where two agreements, or several agreements actually came out. San Remo was the cause of the great complications because that's where the mandate system was included, the first sense of betrayal by international law, and which wasn't accepted by the Arab delegation, and SEF, which decided to recognize these states separately, but again, without recognizing the original Arab Renaissance or the protocol that was enshrined with the Mahmoud-Hussein correspondence. The other date I would mention is 1924, and that is, of course, of the bigger umbrella theme was the fall of the Caliph and the Khilafah, and several occasions happened. For the first time, there is a serious engagement with the idea of Islamic self-determination as well as national self-determination. What I mean by national self-determination is the idea of the territory of the Hijaz instead of Arabia itself. During that time, there were diplomatic conferences in the Islamic world to determine the future of the Khilafah, which was actually conducted or convened by Al-Azhar. But of course, the Hijaz delegation was distracted by the Wahhabi forces' incursions, including the Taif genocide, and then ultimately there was the establishment of the Hijaz National Party, which was in charge of the transfer of power from King Hussein to his son, and then from King Ali to the Saudi ruler Ibn Saud at that stage. And note that the two stamps, one represents the Arab government and the transition to the Hijaz government. This time the Hijaz engages with the international order, understanding what it means to have statehood and not to go beyond certain borders or ideas. I should mention actually, the interesting part is that in 1925, even though a personal union was formed under Ibn Saud with Najd and the Hijaz, it was only the Hijaz that had a state status. The Najd, or the Wahhabi forces, were actually a non-state actor. What does that remind us of? The General Islamic Congress in Jerusalem took place, obviously after the Khilafah conference, which didn't come out with anything in Al-Azhar. In 1928, the Hijaz National Party becomes the Hijaz Liberation Party because the promises of self-governance that were given by Ibn Saud were not met because of too much involvement in the Grand Mosque itself, and the idea of really pushing through a wider program comes into play when a militarized program starting from the north of Hijaz and the south from Asir, but of course the British were there to support Ibn Saud primarily. It wasn't really the Wahhabi forces. The Hijaz was always 1 year behind in terms of international law. What I mean by that is, you can see 1933 was the Montevideo Convention. That's where states were given rights and obligations. Well, there are two theories, the declaratory theory and the constitutive theory. Hijaz was actually met those criteria, but before then, there were no criteria that actually that gave it that right. So in essence, one can argue that there are protections and that there was a status that should have been protected by the League of Nations, either by other members imposing economic sanctions, or alternatively a full-fledged act of war against any incursion. The important point to emphasize here is the National Charter. This National Charter actually very inspiring because it looks at constitutional governance, representation, all sorts of ideas that came out, not from the Levant, but actually within Arabia, about how Arabia should be governed. And I'll come back to that in a moment. It had 7 specific tenets, but as I said, I'll come back to that in a second. The 1940s, as we know, the US actually recognizes Saudi Arabia in 1933. Timing is very interesting. And then in 1940, we enter a stage where, with the United Nations, oil of course looms large, but I'm not going to discuss that since we did have some sort of coverage at that point. The United Nations introduces a new concept of self-determination. It's no longer driven by ethnicity, it's now driven by territorial integrity, a concept that means that now you have the Saudi realm, it is protected, nothing can change that aspect of statehood. The emergence of pan-Arabism and liberal monarchies, of course, or the single-party states as we know it. In this period, I would just say it is fascinating when you look at the Arab revolt or the Hijaz flag, which ultimately was given to the Palestinians, by the way, to guarantee that the mandate they won't accept the mandate, shows us that the states were fragmented along those bases. And Arab statehood, almost in an act of self-imprisonment after the decolonization, the rulers and leaders still take on the Westphalian nation-state idea instead of an Islamic or an Arab view of what that looks like. Of course, 1979 is an important year, not only because of the Iranian Revolution, but as we know, one more time, the Holy Mosque is attacked by the Juhman incursion. I'm going to jump directly and not mention the Sahwa movement and just talk about September 11th for a moment and the Qaeda attack. So, what we know about this is that it changed completely the discourse that Saudi was used to. All of a sudden, we moved to a discussion about where terrorism and failed states were looming large. Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan comes about in 2002, then the war in Iraq in 2003, and then the Arab Spring, where we have a series of revolutions, as you know, but revolutions without a program, like the Arab Renaissance, where it was hijacked by various and different currents of movements, including the Muslim Brotherhood tendencies. 2014, what a year. Daesh comes about. We look at the similarities here, and I know we're going to be discussing them over the course of the 2 days. And I'm not going to use my sort of siyasa sharia hat, but I can say that there are different dynamics where we can see the similarities. One of the more important points sort of to make is that one of the fundamental texts that is used is the Durar al-Saniyya fil Ajwib al-Najdiyya, in terms of the views about Hakimiyya, Wala al-Bara, and Takfir. And this is what they call al-Mufasal al-Jihadi, the differentiation, the jihadist differentiation, which makes the similarities more apparent. But what is relevant? What's relevant were the plans. There is a program, and for those of you who looked at the program, they can see that even the reaction from the Saudi regime, speaking of Bavarian influences, the idea of concentration of violence was something or exclusivity of violence can tell us much about this. It's a wrong thing to point out when we're dealing with Daesh. That's exactly what they want to achieve.
3 minutes.
I apologize. There are other plans about dividing the region this came out of the Air Force Journal, and became subject to debate, including and here we are back to Damascus, and I believe, and the question is, in 2016, is there something that we can learn from the experience of what was declared for the Hijaz to carry forward? The meetings of the Gulf GCC last week tell us that we're still far behind, and I think what I wanted to say is that to propose a way forward, and it's there is the positive space and the negative space. I'm not going to talk about the caliphate that much. It's certainly a respected tradition in so many ways, and I don't think that we should exclude it completely. But, of course, it is in a negative space right now. It's discouraged in terms of the declaratory theory, the constitutive theory, and siyasa sharia. But I do think that there are merits for us to consider when it comes to an Islamic state. Should we have one? Yes. That's my view. This is my grandfather, my great-grandfather, 2 minutes away from here. I stumbled into this wonderful document in the archives of Al-Azhar speaking to the Caliphate Conference, where he spoke about, as the Mufti of Singapore, addressing what the Khilafah should look like with a pragmatic view addressing different languages, addressing different cultures, addressing different realities. So it must be something in the water of the Straits. Let me say that what I mean by this, one, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is a unique special status for the Hijaz. An autonomous, a religiously autonomous status, a status that protects Saudi Arabia for Saudi Arabia, and a status that guarantees participation at so many different levels. And again, I wanted to talk more about it, but I ran out of time. However, let me say the following. There are several areas to cover this project. One is really for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is at a fragile time.
Could you finish, please?
Yes. And I have 1 minute just to summarize it. And its authority is being questioned at a fundamental level, and I can tell you that it needs an alternative to the Wahhabi program. And this autonomy can be within Saudi Arabia protected. Then the Arabian Peninsula, which is it's crucial for the legitimacy of the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula and not the Gulf. The Arab world and the idea of defining it as Western Asia, and this is a need for a socio-economic program, and then we look at the Islamic world in general that needs participation, that needs to look itself in protecting the Hajj, and a lot of these different important projects that jeopardize the Islamic holy places, whether it's ballistic missiles from Yemen, or the bombings in Medina, or Iran's incursion. Finally, I would say that the time has come, I think, for an imam, or the idea of an imam of the two holy mosques. Perhaps it could be someone from Singapore, and she could be someone that's in her 30s. I hope that we can finally, the whole world can engage with the Hijaz in a way that it sees it as a heritage of mankind, and it can define it, and can define Islam the way we do, which is a religion of peace, and bring Islam to our home again. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. The next speaker is Professor Badawi Rashid, who has a sort of stellar academic background, whom we have been very happy to have here as visiting research professor in the Middle East Institute she came about a year ago. Before joining MEI, she was visiting professor at the Middle East Center at LSE, and before that, professor of, I think, head of the Department of Religious Studies at King's College. And, as I say, you can read all about her publications and so forth in the speaker profiles. And the title of her talk is The Mystique of Monarchy, the Magic of Royal Succession.
Thank you, Peter. As the title of my paper suggests, I'll be talking about succession. Professor Greg mentioned the importance of the cohesion of the royal family, and he considered it to be one of his three factors that contribute to the stability and even the resilience of the monarchy. My paper responds to a growing literature in political science whereby the image of the rational autocrat dominates the scene, and we have a growing literature on what is called the resilience of authoritarianism, upgrading of authoritarianism, robustness of authoritarianism, and the modernization of authoritarianism. This literature explains monarchical resilience by highlighting the rational, and underlying the rational, because I'll be coming back to that, the rational strategies of monarchs from integrating the largest number of princes into state institution, what Herb describes as dynastic rule. So this image is often that of a highly rational person at the top of the state, a shrewd player in the game of autocratic survival, and always plotting how to remain unchallenged. he constantly deploys a combination of political control and repression, in addition to deviant soft power, propaganda, coalitions, cooptation, and bribes. As autocrats try to minimize, and they often want to minimize, the price of coercion and violence as much as possible, they build consensus that leads to voluntary servitude. People willingly offer their obedience. In other words, political science literature and theorizing of monarchical strategies invokes the carrot and the sticks. Hence, all the analysis that I have read provides a contextualization of the two strategies. In this literature, the shrewd and calculating prince eventually emerges as a savvy wolf. However, recent scholarship on the survival of monarchy, especially in the GCC, is beginning to challenge previous rationalist perspective. It is often the case that politics in certain contexts, such as that practiced in Saudi Arabia, includes or may elude calculating rationality. If irrational, unpredictable, and even counterproductive measures and forces are attributes of the person who occupies the highest post, namely the king or the father of the nation or the benevolent autocrat, such characteristics have no doubt added to the mystique and magic of the monarch rather than contributed to his rationality. And in my paper, I argue that the more the Saudi monarch seeks to project himself as endorsing a Weberian political rationality, for example, introducing certain institutions and constitutions, for example, the Basic Law of Government and the Committee of Allegiance, to deal with the succession to the throne, or adopts economic rational transformation visions and models, such as that of Vision 2030, the more salient, irrational, and unpredictable features become. So if rationalization is tantamount to the increasing pervasiveness of the means and purposeful and instrumental social action, disenchantment and demagification, the Saudi monarch relies increasingly and heavily on non-rational elements for survival, a continuous state of the anesthesia of unreason. And I borrow this from discussions and the literature of the British monarchy. So let me move on to succession. We know that since the 1990s there had been a deliberate so-called rational attempt by the Saudi monarchs to introduce mechanisms that deal with succession. So for example, in 1992, King Fahd introduced the Basic Law of Government, which is not regarded as a constitution because Saudi Arabia claims that its constitution is the Quran. But it's an important document that it was introduced in 1992, not to regulate relation between ruler and ruled, as most constitutions do, but to regulate rules within the royal family. So the document insisted and emphasized that the House of Saud are the legitimate rulers of the country. But it left the question of who should succeed or how succession should be to the future generation. In 2007, there was also a rational attempt by King Abdullah to create the Committee of Allegiance, which consisted of the most senior princes, around 33 of them, who would meet to decide on the future king. So this was hailed as a rational element, institutionalizing succession, with the hope or the illusion that one day Saudi Arabia will have an elected king. As this is contradiction in terms, because kings are usually not elected. But this was the point of that rational move. We come very swiftly, I want to move you to 2015, after the death of King Abdullah, who put a system and invented a new post called Wali al-Ahd, Deputy Crown Prince, which didn't exist before. And he put certain princes in position. So the king was king, then he had a crown prince, King Salman now, and a deputy crown prince who was Prince Mugran. Within 3 months after the death of King Abdullah, King Salman changed the succession and asked Prince Mugran to leave, basically. So this brings me to the question is, this kind of behavior, regardless of all the institutional and so-called rational mechanisms that were put in place, were overturned immediately within 3 months. So King Salman's new appointments were destined to generate more ambiguity and speculation after he dies. The appointment of Mohammed bin Nayef created a bridge to move the throne into vertical succession after it had followed a horizontal line. But with Salman changes, the succession will he change it before he dies? Will Mohammed bin Nayef ever become king? Will Mohammed bin Nayef change the succession if he does become king? Will Mohammed bin Salman remain crown prince and wait for a long time to become king, given that Mohammed ibn Nayef is only in his late 50s? Who will be the deputy crown prince when Mohammed ibn Salman becomes crown prince? So all these questions are very difficult to answer in the Saudi context. So in a way, my paper looks at the principles of succession that had taken place since the 18th century, which I will not go into great detail, but key to that succession was primogeniture in the 18th century and the 19th century. And in the 20th century, with the establishment of the more contemporary modern Saudi state, it happened once, and that is when King Abdulaziz, after 1932, designated his successor as his eldest son at the time. However, the eldest son is not always destined to become king, because there is another concept that invoked in this system, and that is seniority, or seniority on the basis of al-aslah, the best. And this is a very vague concept, because there had been eligible and princes who would have liked to become kings, but they were sidelined. So in a way, the succession in Saudi Arabia, regardless of how much we try to theorize it and predict it, remains ambiguous. By highlighting the ambiguity of succession, I think the mystical and magical aspects of monarchy are more convincing as ways of looking at the durability of the Saudi monarchy than looking at the rational strategies that they adopt while they are in office. I do not dismiss structural, domestic conditions and international and regional factors that have sustained the monarchy, and we heard Professor Rose discuss them, especially during the Arab uprisings. However, I would like to shift the analysis from regime strategies to societal conditions, such as domestic regional fragmentation, sectarian divides, ideological polarization between Islamists and non-Islamists, and religious dogma in supporting the status quo to explain why the Saudi regime survived the turmoil of the Arab uprising. However, neither a deterministic political economy approach, whether we call it the rentier state model, the subsidies in return for loyalty under the pressure of the Arab uprising, nor excessive repression fully explain the enigma of Saudi Arabia. I think my paper tried to develop the theme that there is something about monarchies, not that they are natural or that people obey them better than when they are in republic. I think unlike presidential republics and the Arab quasi-constitutional monarchies, such as Jordan, Morocco, and Bahrain, the Saudi monarchy generates both hope and illusion, thus creating semi-magical mystique that contributes to an irrational expectation about affluence and prosperity even at times of falling oil prices, budget deficit, and shrinking welfare services. So instead of the image dominant in the literature on authoritarian survival of the calculating monarch who is constantly preoccupied with his own survival by deploying rational strategies, I want to shift the analysis to more emotional dispositions, attachments, and above all, rumors, all related to the power of uncertainty and hope, both often ignored in the analysis of authoritarian and autocratic rule. So, in the paper, I look at how this emotional disposition, the ability of the monarch to generate the illusion of hope, fear, and hope come together to explain the survival of monarchies. So, I want to emphasize that the ambiguity of succession in Saudi Arabia generates a moment of irrationality, but also a moment of rumors. And by looking at rumors that are abundant in Saudi Arabia about who is going to succeed, who is fighting who among the princes, it is a window of opportunity to look at how Saudis insert themselves in the political narrative about the country. That a country that marginalizes individuals, does not allow the growth of a civil society, in fact curtails all political, civil, and human rights among people. So in the absence of an institutional way of inserting yourself in the politics of Saudi Arabia, Saudis engage in these rumors. So let me just go very briefly and describe a couple of these rumors that are worth studying, simply because they are a window of opportunity to see how the ambiguity, the illusion, the hope insert themselves in Saudi society. So after 2015, with the reshuffles that Prince Salman started, we have three, I think, rumors that began to emerge. First, that the brothers of the king are plotting against him. The second rumor is that there is a rift between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Nayef. And Mohammed bin Salman is accumulating so many powers in order to overrule his cousin and become the king. Then we have another rumor circulated by second-generation princes who have been excluded from political positions in the kingdom. So these rumors have gained momentum among Saudis. And in order to counter them, we may think that rumors are really not that important, they're just rumors. But political rumors are extremely important, simply because they throw light on what society is thinking. Had they not been so important, we would not have had so many opinions issued by the highest religious authority, the Mufti of Saudi Arabia, warning people against rumors. That these are the work of people who are a fifth column, who are determined to destroy Saudi Arabia. They are opportunists, and therefore the government as well criminalizes anybody who speculates about Saudi succession. I think we've got somebody here, I wouldn't name, who was actually asked to leave Saudi Arabia within like 48 hours, simply because he did not circulate a rumor, but mentioned the unmentionable, that one of the senior princes was ill with cancer, so he had to leave the country. So there are strict rules about how Saudis should deal with succession issues, mainly not to mention them and not to discuss them. At the level of society, also there is a very strong opinion that circulates about, I will just try to translate it, is that when it comes to Saudi succession, those who know don't talk, and those who talk don't know. And this is actually a loyalist position to discriminate and to discredit any kind of attempt to understand royal succession. It should not be discussed, basically. It is not something that is that Saudis could engage in freely. However, they always do. And there are certain incidents that have taken place when people were actually ended up in prison as a result of discussing royal succession. We also have a new phenomenon in Saudi Arabia that emerged with the advent of social media. Quite a lot of people circulate these opinions and these rumors. And it had forced the Saudi authorities, mainly the official press, to respond to them, given how important they are. So I wanted to discuss one person, a virtual reality that had actually prompted many responses from Saudi Arabia to either discredit what he says or respond to it simply. And that is the Mujtahid phenomenon. I don't know if you've heard about Mujtahid. Mujtahid is a virtual character who is called the Julian Assange of Saudi Arabia. He releases documents, he releases opinions, he anticipates what the king is going to do, who is going to be sacked, who is going to be confirmed in his position. This Mujtahid has prompted international media to engage with what he has to say on Twitter. He's got like over, last time I checked, like 1.8 million or 1.6 million followers. And it also prompted the Saudi Mufti to respond to what he has to say and discredit him. But I engaged with Mujtahid and interviewed him, and it transpired that he was trying to achieve one thing. Basically, he doesn't see himself as an authority or a political opposition. He claims that he gets his information from disgruntled princes or people in government, and he releases this information. In a way, these kind of issues that emerge at the societal level involve expressions of wanting to be part of the political narrative of Saudi Arabia, but continuously not allowed to do so. So the succession is not an issue for Saudis to discuss, but it is an issue and it remains the prerogative of the king. So the king, from now until he dies, he will have the right to change the succession that he already put in place. And there's nothing to stop him, not even a rational institutional base or a constitution or a document. So as a result of this, Saudis engage in rumors about successions, very much like the international media and any observer. And they constantly interpret fragmented information, follow anonymous sources online, such as Mujtahid, and also fabricate their own stories about the top level of government. So the mystical monarch, that you cannot predict his actions, pushes citizens to turn to rumors to anticipate the future and decode the quasi-magical awe of royalty. All this is not being irrational, but in fact it adds to the mystique and the power of the Saudi monarch and enhances conspicuous submission to the monarch. So to conclude, I think by studying rumors and taking them as aspects of the political culture of the country, rather than simply dismiss them as the fabrication of outside agents, I think these multiple rumors about succession are a great distraction from real long-term structural problems such as social upheaval, unemployment levels, housing shortages, budget deficit, corruption, detentions, and gender discrimination in Saudi Arabia. Rumors have become central to the mystique of the Saudi monarchy, in which people transcend their powerlessness, marginalization, and above all, the fragmentation, their fragmentation by region, class, tribe, race, and sect. Engaging in the study of rumors is not a descent into ghaibiyat, the unknown, irrational impulses, and wishful thinking, but I think Saudis engage in these rumors as an assertion of agency against forces that continue to marginalize them. Those who start and spread rumors insert themselves into the public narrative about the king, about who will rule the country. Also, the narrative about stability and politics in a monarchy that allows its citizens almost no modern participation in decision-making process. The recent surge in Saudi cyber resistance, that is, people who express themselves on the internet, through the circulation of letters and rumors, are modern forms of challenging official narratives and inserting one's voice into a mystical political realm. Thank you.
Well, it's difficult to assert my sort of chairman's, I say, timekeeping abilities from so far away, but I'm glad you kept within the time limit. So the next speaker is Stefan Hertog, who's Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at LSE in London. His research interests include Gulf politics, Middle East political economy, political violence and radicalization, and he has published a well-known book called Princes, Brokers and Bureaucrats, Oil and State in Saudi Arabia in 2011, and he's co-author of Engineers of Jihad, The Curious Connection Between Violent Extremism and Education, published by Princeton in 2016. And the title of his talk is Challenges to the Saudi Distributional State in the Age of Austerity.
A quick disclaimer, which is that the paper that I've written is less a paper than a loose survey of a couple of things that I kind of wanted to get off my chest, not having written anything systematic about the Saudi political economy since my book came out. So in some ways, it's sort of a coda to Princes, Brokers and Bureaucrats. So it is, in a sense, also the preface to the second edition that I would write if anyone would ask me to issue a second edition of the book, which unfortunately hasn't happened yet. So it was originally meant to be a mostly historical paper, complementing in some ways, correcting some of the things that I'd said in the book, looking at the origins of the distributional state in Saudi Arabia. And then because so much has happened recently, also because Madawi motivated me to comment on the changes since late 2014 in terms of economic policy and the political economy of the Saudi leadership, then tries to draw the arc, probably not that successfully, from the origins of the distributional state in the 50s and 60s to the challenges that it's facing now under King Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, and it compares the political challenges that the regime was exposed to in the age of Arab nationalism back then to the way that certain distributional reforms and austerity policies are actually not systematically challenged or haven't been systematically challenged most recently. So it's a kind of contrast between the two eras that I think motivates the paper, if there's any kind of guiding theme. Is there a PowerPoint remote control? That would be fantastic. Sorry, I should have asked before. Great, thank you. So that's what I'm quickly going to do. Look at the historical origins of Saudi Arabia's distributive states, recapitulating some of the things that I've said in Princes, Brokers, but also complementing it with, I think, a dimension that I neglected in the book, which is that there was an acute, at least perceived, challenge from leftist and nationalist forces to the Al-Saud, which didn't determine the details of the state, the building of fiefdoms, the fragmentation of the state, all the kind of bureaucratic politics that I outlined in the book, which I think did shape the very distributive nature of institution building, the fact that all those fiefdoms then served a purpose, in many cases, of mass distribution of employment, of subsidies, and of other private and public goods. And then I quickly outline some of the unintended legacies in terms of distorted labor markets, a very distorted private sector emerging from that distributive state, which really was a reaction to the nationalist challenges of the 50s and 60s, and then look at the way that the regime has been trying to reform that distributive state since 2015 and the very fundamental structural challenges that it's faced in that context, arguing that, although I'm not a dispassionate observer in that discussion, that below the very top level where there's been very momentous change, very, very little has really changed in Saudi Arabia structurally since 2014. One thing that I don't think Middle East political economists understand well enough is that oil-rich states in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia in particular, are not representative of oil-rich states across most of the developing world, in the sense that they're unusually generous in material terms. So the delivery of basic public goods, the extent of state employment, the extent of subsidization. Many people looking at the Middle East think it's a natural outcome of just being oil-rich, but that's actually not the case at all. If you look at oil-rich states in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, they often do worse than their neighbors in terms of public goods delivery, in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of providing employment to citizens. So there's actually a research puzzle behind why the oil wealth in the Middle East has been converted into mass patronage and mass wealth. Here are just two graphs showing that the Saudi regime, however authoritarian it's been and however inefficient its public service delivery has been in comparison to the rest of the region, and even more so in comparison to the rest of the developing world, quite successful at delivering some basic goods in terms of full school enrollment, in terms of reducing child mortality, and I could also show you graphs about the extent of state employment, which is really quite unique for a mid-income country like Saudi Arabia. Now, why has this happened? Why have they been materially so generous? And the argument that I'm developing in the paper, that I've also been pursuing in a joint project with Ferdinand Eibel from King's College, is that it's been bottom-up political challenges that have motivated the distributive state building in the 50s and 60s into that kind of welfare model that we've seen emerging all across the Middle East and oil-rich states. So on the one hand, a lot of the detail of state building is really the story that I've mapped out in Prince and Brokers and Bureaucrats. So a lot of the fragmentation, the princely fiefdoms, the deep heterogeneity between different parts of the state, some of which are controlled by religious forces, some of which are controlled personally by princes, others are kind of pockets of efficiency of technocracy. I think all of that story still holds true, but I think a cross-cutting motivation of sharing a lot of wealth through not all, but many of those institutions, I think that has roots that I've neglected in the book. And if we went back to some of the political key events of the 50s and 60s, and also did that for all the other Gulf countries, we're planning to do it also for other oil-rich countries in the rest of the world, only to show the absence of similar processes. I think the key motivating events were the political contestation through Arab nationalism and then later on various leftist ideologies that coursed through the whole Arabian Peninsula in that era, that never were mass movements, but that nonetheless were perceived as acutely threatening by those ruling elites. And a quite nice, almost smoking gun sort of piece of evidence in the archives showing that those rulers were really very acutely concerned about those threats, and critically, that they saw development and providing public goods and building a state as a means to take the bite out of that revolutionary challenge. And that it also works very nicely in unexpected places like Abu Dhabi, where Zayed conspired with the family to get rid of Shah Qut because he was seen as not being willing to share the wealth. There was an acute sense that there were Arab nationalist challenges, leftist challenges, particularly in northern Emirates. It works very nicely in Oman, where Qaboos really took over from his father when both he and the British thought that the policy of not sharing any of the wealth was leading to a communist revolution. I think was a fairly precise reading of the situation. And in Saudi Arabia, all those key moments when the leadership was reminded, or at least thought that it was in a very brittle situation, similar to the other monarchies that had fallen across the Arab world. And I spell out some of this on the basis of diplomatic archival material in the paper, so we don't have to walk through all of this, but I think it's critical in understanding the Saud-Faisal rivalry, that the balance of power between the two often shifted in sync with the ideological challenges that the Al Saud then faced from first Nasserism and later on other forms of nationalism and leftism, and that they kind of outbeat each other on welfare programs that very much were Nasserist inspired. And they kind of took the economic program of Nasserism and took out the political elements of it. If you look at the 10-point program by Faisal in 1962, that really in many regards was a kind of Nasserist development program, None of the political points were implemented, but the welfare elements of it were really implemented quite effectively to the letter on the basis of growing oil income. Rentier welfare in its various guises, health service, education service, state employment subsidization, infrastructure provision, and so on and so forth, was really a counter-revolutionary policy, I would argue. And Faisal personally told his fellow ruler, Rashid of Dubai, that revolution came from poverty, and that to forestall revolution, the Gulf states would need to be developed. And there are many other kind of verbatim pieces of evidence of that kind of thinking also from other Gulf rulers. It's something that probably disseminated across the region as rulers spoke to each other. And although I can't go into any detail, again, the record across the whole region seems to suggest that this strategy really worked. That when those mass distribution states were created, when they were set up in the 70s, there was a lull in opposition's activity that's really continued, with the exception of Bahrain and partly of Kuwait, up until the present day. If you compare those countries with the street level politics, like in unlikely places like Qatar or Abu Dhabi in the 50s and 60s, the cooptation really seems to have worked and seems to have undercut the autonomy and the mobilizational power of kind of horizontal ideological networks in society. And I would hold that that even holds for a lot of the Islamists in Saudi Arabia. So there's a nice citation in the book by Vasiliev on the history of the kingdom, by Saudi communists complaining how the emergence of consumerist society in the 1970s had made all the revolutionaries lazy, and they were just not interested in politics anymore. There are many individual vignettes of oppositionists being co-opted and of people losing interest in the revolution at that time when oil wealth was shared on a mass basis. What happened, of course, at the same time is the old story from Prince's Brokers, that as the state was built, senior princes used that also as a tool to build their own fiefdoms, so health services, education, employment were often provided through personal fiefdoms like the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Interior, the National Guard, that allowed those princes to build their own systems of patronage, but it also served the broader purpose of wealth sharing. So I don't think those two accounts are really rival. I think they're complementary. And I think in terms of rentier state theory, the story tells us two things. One is that if you're oil rich, it doesn't automatically pacify the population. It's quite the opposite. There were a lot of challenges actually generated by the sudden visibility of oil wealth in the 50s and 60s. That comes out quite explicitly in some of the revolutionary literature from that time, that people said that, this is our national patrimony, we want to share this, we want to use this to build a new state. And in Oman, for example, the visibility of oil wealth that wasn't shared with the population actually motivated revolutionary movements. But it was then in the second stage, the use of that oil wealth for distribution and cooperation that then actually triggered the kind of mechanisms that rentier state theory makes us expect in terms of cooperation and political pacification of society. So, what are some of the consequences of wealth sharing? We can go into the politics. I do believe that it has fragmented society, it has fragmented autonomous social groups that could have challenged the regime. I think that story is broadly true. It has also created deep economic distortions that were not necessarily intended and that now hobble the regime and prevent it from adjusting in an era of lower oil prices. It has created incentives for unsustainable forms of production in the private sector, unsustainable forms of consumption. It has incentivized Saudis, 2/3 of whom on the labor market are still state employed, to seek skills that are irrelevant for the private sector. It has deepened the material dependence of both households and business on state distribution, and thereby has created demands that feed on that system and that have until recently forced the system to expand its distributional structure continuously. So it's ironic that the very welfare that the nationalists demanded in the 50s and 60s have, on the one hand, undercut politically autonomous groups, have made people dependent on the kind of paternal welfare state controlled by the Al Saud, but they're now also a threat to the long-term survival of at least the current incarnation of the regime. Well, I don't need to go through the details of that, those are just various graphs showing how distortionary and costly the current model of wealth sharing is, and declining energy efficiency, an extremely high share of state employees among nationals on the labor market, really nothing like it in the rest of the world, with the exception of other GCC countries and Brunei, which is the kind of one non-GCC country. A very clear preference for white-collar state-provided employment, a rejection of most of the jobs that would be available in the normal private sector, a very pronounced preference for government employment over any other type of employment. So all kinds of things that make the pursuit, the implementation of things like the National Transformation Program or the Vision 2030 very, very difficult structurally. Also a very pronounced dependence of the private sector on state spending. You see that the size of the private sector here traces over time the size of state spending very, very exactly. So if they're going for austerity now, this is going to hit the private sector very, very brutally, much more so than the regime itself has realized when engaging in various cuts and not paying their contractors in 2015 and 2016. And very low labor productivity, because most of the actual work is done by low-skilled foreigners, which serves both Saudi households, who thereby can have a modern economy, at least in some sense, while not having to themselves be involved in the productive circuit. You couldn't have everyone accommodated in idle public sector employment if you didn't have the foreigners doing some of the actual work in the private sector. And of course, also very beneficial to the Saudi private sector that could very rapidly scale up and expand during the oil boom at a pace that would have been impossible on the basis of drawing just on the national workforce. But that very setup, of course, makes the private sector, again, more state-dependent, and not only through the provision of visas and the auto migration regime, but also the fact that those low-skilled workers earn very little, and most of what they earn they remit abroad, which means that there's very little private demand generation. Most demand comes from Saudi households, which are mostly households relying on state salaries. So there's almost no private demand generation. It all does come from government. And the expatriate dependence of the labor markets is part of that story. So what has happened most recently is that some of the aspects of that distributive system have been questioned, but by a regime that itself hasn't quite understood the structural constraints, I think, that is under. If you look at the vision and the NTP, it doesn't really address any of the key binding constraints created by the distributive system. It talks a lot about private-driven growth and Saudization in a way that doesn't address the distorted labor market, that doesn't address the dependence on state employment, that only begins to address the dependence of business on state demand and state subsidization. So a economic reform program that is also institutionally and socially very disconnected from the actual structures in the Saudi political economy, that the private sector doesn't understand what the vision is about. It wasn't consulted about it, is very upset about what's been going on, has been promised privatization, private-driven initiative and growth, and the only thing that's happened on the ground is that the government has stopped paying its bills. So a huge disconnect between expectations and the reality. The interesting thing about the adjustment after 2014, to the extent that there has been any adjustment beyond the rhetoric of the vision and the NTP, is that the fiscal cuts have been much more brutal and much more substantial than what you've seen in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think this indicates that there has been real change on the level of the regime leadership. So there's, as Greg already pointed out, there's a much lower level of risk aversion. Mohammed bin Salman in particular is not in the mold of the old consensual princes who try to get buy-in, a majority of support in the ruling family. He doesn't seem to care much about that. The structure of the top leadership has changed entirely. There are very few people who are in charge now, and on the economic front, it seems to be pretty much only Mohammed bin Salman until recently. But a lot of what he's done has again followed established patterns that we've seen before. So to the extent that he has tried to reform institutions, the creation of new parallel fiefdoms, of new committees, of new state-owned enterprises, very much followed the old pattern of kind of lateral state expansion and fiefdom building that we've seen in previous eras. The one thing that's different from the old collective, the old era of collective princely rule from 62 to 2014 is that he's been tinkering with the pockets of efficiency. They were always completely off limits for the ruling family. So he's sidelined Sama, the central bank and sovereign wealth fund, is trying to set up a parallel sovereign wealth fund. Recently, money has been transferred out of Sama into the public investment fund, which is his personal pay thing, and he's trying to set up a Aramco. So that's a fundamental shift in the way they deal with the state apparatus, something that's seen as very risky by the established technocracy, and something that I also think is a very, very risky step. And at the same time, he's pushed a more vigorous fiscal adjustment. There was a lot of fiscal adjustment in the 80s and 90s that was completely at the expense of the private sector. So private sector bills went unpaid, like this time, and the capital expenditure budget was slashed. Everything else was protected. The mass distributional system established in the 70s was protected, actually expanded every year. The Saudi regime added to its payroll every single year in the 1980s and 1990s, despite 16 or 17 years of consecutive budget deficits. Differently, this time there have been subsidy cuts directly affecting households, and there have been substantial cuts to public sector allowances. It's the first time that salaries have really been touched in modern Saudi history, really. And that's unprecedented. And that has set off a diffuse but very disorganized political backlash and has undercut, to an important extent, the domestic legitimacy of Mohammed bin Salman. But importantly, it hasn't really led to any kind of organized challenge. So it's very different from the very contentious politics that we had in the 50s and 60s when the distributional state was first built as a reaction to modern ideological challenges. This time, we don't see an organized counter-challenge to that. We just see a lot of grumbling, but it seems that the long-term legacy of social fragmentation that has emerged through the building of the distributional state from the 60s on, it has really undercut, at least for the time being, the capacity in Saudi society to mount an organized challenge of that austerity program. So on that basis, my prediction, I think, is very similar to Greg's. I think the regime is actually more autonomous politically than it itself believed to be. It could have probably been much more brutal on austerity before in the 80s and 90s if it had wanted to. So a lot of this kind of clientelistic constraint of the regime was really self-imposed. So they can actually get away with a lot. But at the same time, they have to operate with a state apparatus and with a distorted economy that is very, very far from the kind of private-driven, diversified structures that the vision is talking about. So my prediction is that Saudi Arabia is not probably going through a revolution. It's probably not going to see mass upheaval, though we never know. I think it's gradually becoming Egyptianized. So I think there will be a decline in real income, a decline in the quality of state services, a decline in infrastructure, but continuing state dependence of the economy and of households. On that